Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started on this afternoon's webinar. I think it's top of the hour, so we'll get a move on it here. My name is Aida Awad, and I'm an instructor at Broward College. I'm also Secretary-Treasurer and past President of NAGT, and I'm happy to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar, where Dr. Deb Morrison will be talking about STEM teaching tools, professional learning resources for equitable 3D instruction, in parentheses, NGSS. That's how we kind of translate that. And this webinar is being brought to you by the NGSS Working Group, which is co-sponsored by NAGT, AGI, Center for Geoscience and the Society, and NESTA. John, do you want to go ahead and advance the slide? Okay, so in our next about 58 minutes that we have together, I'm going to just do some quick welcome information, and then we'll turn things over to Deb Morrison for a 45-minute presentation, which will be followed by discussion and Q&A. I believe that Deb has some interactive portions built into the body of her webinar, which I think we're all looking forward to very much. And then after those Q&A comments and discussion, we'll have a quick wrap-up and go over some future events. So just as a preview, some upcoming events. Our webinars do run the second Thursday of every month, and our next webinar will be Thursday, November 9th, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. It is entitled A Sampling of Federal Education Resources Supporting Earth and Space Science Instruction, and I'm very excited to announce that we will have representatives from NOAA on that webinar. We will have representatives from NASA Goddard on that webinar and from AGI, and they'll be talking about resources and some interesting things about policy. So please click on the link or follow the way to the link at the bottom of this slide. We'll show it again at the end of the webinar, and you will be able to access registration information. I believe that will also be sent out to you with the archive link for this webinar, and thanks John Maderas for just putting it in the chat now. Also, if you'll be attending GSA in Seattle later this month, there is a session T114 on Tuesday, the 24th, from 1:30 to 5:30. That's the oral session. On Wednesday, all day, poster session entitled Getting It Done, Experiences of Implementing the Framework and NGSS in Earth and Space Science. So those are the announcements. We'll put that slide up again at the end of the webinar, and we can go ahead and get started with our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Deb Morrison at this point, and thanks, Deb. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, so just a brief bio on me. You are more than welcome to look up all sorts of details about me at my bio website, which is in the chat window. My specialty is in the area of formative assessment, equity, and teacher education. I currently work at the Institute for Science and Math Education at the University of Washington. And here we have a number of initiatives that kind of work around the center of my own work and expand out into other spaces. So what I'm going to talk to you about today specifically is the resources that we have in the STEM teaching tools portfolio that we have been co-designing and developing with people, and not just us, other folks have been developing across the United States around NGSS and more broadly around the K-12 framework. The framework for K-12 science education. Some states are non-adopters of NGSS, but our resources, we actually just did a major revamp of all of our resources to make them generic enough that they can be in their language, that they can be used in non-adopting states. All right. So in thinking about these resources, you can have a look at them as we start to explore and please multitask, that is encouraged. So it is at stemteachingtools.org, and if you can just kind of explore different ones as we go through. All right, so the STEM Teaching Tools project is part of a larger project called the Research and Practice Collaboratory, and the link is there on the slide. That partnership and the work across there's 4 major sites in the U.S., the work across those sites is really about trying to connect research to practice and practice to research. So it's a bi-directional goal. And so the work that we've been doing here in Washington State is with our collaborators in Seattle Public Schools and in Renton Public Schools, and we have worked very deeply in their own professional development work and their practice in their classrooms, and they have heavily informed many of the STEM teaching tools that we've written here internally. Other spaces that are listed there on the slide, Inverness, University of Colorado, some folks out in Maine, they have all also contributed to the STEM teaching tool pool, and we have an open call for folks who are doing really interesting things that contribute to that space to help them write STEM teaching tools. So do consider that. I will come back to that at the end of the presentation. Also, one thing before I go much further, I encourage you to put comments in the chat window as we go, and myself or Aida or John will try and respond to them, but I'm happy to be interrupted and address your questions as they arise. So please feel free to do that. So the STEM teaching tools are more than just the tools themselves. They are also Twitter space, and we have Pinterest space. So really thinking of the resources themselves as a connection into a larger community of science educators and science teachers and researchers who are working in this space. So if you are into social media, I do encourage you to connect into the STEM teaching tools on the Twitter space, because then new updates and emerging resources are propagated inside that space. So let's take a look at a STEM teaching tool itself and kind of break down. We have a set format for the tools, and this is to make them easy to use so that the cognitive load that we have around looking at a new resource is not about how the resource is organized, it's more about the material in the resource. So we have some non-standard tools, but most of our tools follow this formatting. We look at what is the issue. We try to give a really concise title. Often the titles are formed in a question format. The question that a practitioner would have, a teacher in their own classroom would have as they're trying to understand some aspect of their practice. So there's a title and then a short description that all fits on the front page of why is this a problem of practice? What's the issue? And then on the side of the tool, we have this idea of why it matters to you. And in the why it matters to you section, we actually usually break it down by why it matters to you as a teacher, why it matters to you as a district staff or PD provider, and then why it might matter to you as a school leader. Sometimes if the tool is more broad, it might be also things that might matter to you as more of a state kind of related issue. But most of these are internal to district or school work, and most of them are actually internal to classroom practice. On the back of the tool, of the sort of standard tool, are a couple of other sections. So one of them is things to consider. So what do you need to think about around this issue to expand your own understanding about this issue? And we're going to dig into some specific examples of this in a minute. But here there's things like inside your own classroom, what might be some challenges around this, inside your community that you work with. Maybe it's about how you collaborate with colleagues around this issue, stereotypes or things that you might have, implicit biases that you might be carrying with you, that you might need to interrogate in different ways. There's some guidance about actions that you can take, and those actions are related to the things to consider. In those two sections, we generally hyperlink out to supplementary resources. So while the tool itself is usually a one-page document, the digital version of the tool is really deep. And we use the one-pager to help you kind of frame the overarching problem and then work digitally with the digital version of the tool to sort of dig into the problem. And then links to related resources, so other STEM teaching tools, Sometimes those are external resources if there are partners that we're working with in other spaces that have particular resources that will really help understand this problem or resource you in particular ways around the problem. Up in the upper right-hand side, there's reflection questions. Sometimes they're worded as things to think about, sometimes they're questions. And those are often really great pieces to use if you're using these tools in a professional learning community or with a smaller group of teachers, that you actually use those questions to open discussion. And then right underneath that is usually a section that we actually now have labeled. I see on the example here we don't, but in many of our tools we now have labeled as attending to equity. And they highlight different dimensions of equity. Equity is a huge, broad topic. And so we try to be very specific about how this tool unpacks some aspect of equity. One of the critiques I've heard of the way that we have these organized is that equity is set apart in a particular section of the document. However, that was intentional in the design of the tools because we wanted to make sure that we called out for folks who weren't deeply embedded in equity work, that we called out specifically how this works for equity, so that when you're working on your school improvement plan or you're working on your own personal development of an equity perspective relative to the framework of K-12 education, that you can name how it is that you're working on equity. And that's something that as we sort of progress on our own journeys toward understanding inequities and equity in education, that we need to actually be very explicit about as we move along. So that was intentional to actually pull that out and name it, both as an internal processing sort of move and also as how you can talk to your colleagues about this work that you're doing. All right. So in terms of the STEM teaching tools themselves, I think of this as our brag slide in some ways. So we have a serious uptake of these tools, and they're not very old. They're, I can't remember what we're up to now in terms of the numbers. We keep adding to the pool, but it's only been a couple of years that we've actually had these tools in play. We're up to 51 tools now, and they've had hundreds of thousands of use overall. In the last year, so this past year, they've tripled in usage and had much broader geographic use. And because we have this plan of how we use social media is actually generating about 20% of our traffic right now on the site itself. So, and that's increasing. We have significant traffic that comes in from associations. We have connections and are increasing our connections with things like NSTA and Achieve. We have a lot of collaborative work that is going on with those organizations, and also the Council of State Science Supervisors is significant in how they're starting to access these resources as well. So you can see the sort of plan across, or that data across the 1 month that we just picked as an example. And one thing to look at where you see peaks, the peaks in this kind of data are related to events, so NSTA or meetings that we have with particular folks, professional development events that folks hold, where that generates access to the site because people are becoming more aware of it and are starting to use these and pull them. In terms of our practitioners who are using these, we have a range of different folks who are using them, people inside professional development, so teachers inside professional development events, and teachers inside the classroom are a significant component. We also have school leaders starting to access these, as well as professional developers more generally. And we encourage the use of school leaders looking at these. So if a teacher is shifting practice in a particular way, we encourage you to take the STEM teaching tools to your school leaders to help them understand what reformed science looks like in the classroom, so that when they are coming in to do evaluations or walkthroughs in your room, that they have some kind of background and understanding on what they're seeing. So we're finding that the STEM teaching tools are actually opening an opportunity of conversation between science teachers and their building administrators. and they're working as sort of educative tools between those two individuals, especially if your school administrators don't have backgrounds in science. Yeah, it is really terrific to see school leaders involved in this. So one of the really interesting little pieces of information that NSTA sent out last year, or Mark Smith did, involved in the NSTA analysis, was this sort of map of Twitter. And we found that STEM Teaching Tools was actually the third top influencer in their Twitter feed at the conference this past year, the LA National Conference, which we found really fascinating. So folks, we had a number of different sessions at the national conference, but it was also just the way in which our feed was being passed around between different folks who are at NSTA. And that actually increased attendance at some of our sessions, but it's also, for us, it's the idea that the teachers who are attending our sessions are finding those tools really valuable in how they're engaging with them, and because of that, they're passing it on to other teachers and other people in that space, or other entities in the NSTA space. So that is really, really helpful for us to know that particular resources are like really moving through space in a particular way, because that helps us understand which tools are actually most influential and build more like them. So there is a way to access the PDF version of the tools. This is the link for it. Aida and John, I'm not sure if the links are live in the slide deck, so if somebody can like grab those and throw them into the chat window, that would be awesome. So the PDF deck is really helpful if you're working with peers who are not really technologically savvy, or folks who just want to look at paper. Sometimes there's great value in getting off our computers so we're not multitasking and we're just working with paper. So even though we are very technologically savvy, we tend to work with paper with our teachers when we first introduce tools, just to get people digging in and looking at the questions and talking to each other, because we learn that way. So it's a very good idea, if you're going to use these tools with colleagues or in teacher education settings, that you really consider using the paper version initially and then moving into the digital stuff. All right, so we are going to look at a couple different aspects of the STEM Teaching Tool site. Feel free to go to the live site if you like. The link is at the bottom there. But I'm going to walk you through some screenshot versions of it just to kind of like look at what the collection is. So we're going to start with the tools piece. There are some really interesting pieces on the home and the about page as well, but I'm not going to go there today. So feel free to have a look at those other spaces. We're going to just explore the tools themselves right now. So the tools range across a wide variety of implementation, sort of what we consider problems of practice, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're problems in the classic sense of the word problem. They're more challenges and opportunities and issues that we're running into in terms of our own understanding as practitioners, but also the interactions and interrelationships that we have as classroom teachers with our students and with our families and communities. And so some of those things are around issues that we're teaching. So things like climate change. Climate change is a controversial topic, but it's not a scientifically controversial topic. It's a social controversy. And so we have things like STEM Teaching Tool 12 here that help you think about how to do that inside a classroom. And we also have some other STEM teaching tools that talk about controversy itself and how to have controversial classroom conversations and unpack what is controversy. If somebody can do a little quick search in the search bar at the top of the STEM teaching tool and post the link for what resources you find around controversy and teaching controversial topics, that would be super awesome. All right, there's also ones about inquiry. So we have a lot of terminology that we use in science teaching which have many, many meanings. So the idea of science and engineering practices and the idea of inquiry in science, those things are really woven in long histories of science teaching and learning. And so there are ideas that we can kind of break apart and think about as we help teachers understand what is different about the NGSS standards and the sort of framework for K-12 science education perspective on learning, and traditional sort of inquiry perspectives or scientific method kind of perspectives on teaching and learning. So those are resources that I would definitely point to as really helpful in sort of grounding ourselves in shared understandings. Then we get into some of the aspects around culture. So culture is never something that science teachers have been super comfortable with. And as we expand into perspectives on learning that are socioculturally situated, we're trying to understand what that means inside a science classroom. The K-12 science, the framework on K-12 science education is deeply situated in modern perspectives on what it means to learn in multicultural settings. And even if the setting is very monocultural in some way, what it means to live in a multicultural world. And so trying to bring in everyday understandings and community interests and expertise into our science classrooms is something that science teachers have not been well trained in. And this kind of falls under the broad perspective of culturally based pedagogy, so culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogies. And we've heard about them and thought about them a little bit, but trying to get at what they mean in classrooms is what some of these briefs are for. So you can also search for other types of cultural resources with the search bar. Thank you very much, Aida, for finding the controversy one. So if anybody wants to do a search on culture or community interests, identity, those types of things, you can see what kinds of resources you come up with in doing that. The other big area of resources, and we have some playlists which we'll get to a little bit later on this, are things about talk. So there has been an enormous amount of research done in the last few years, in the last decade, or even 2 decades, around talk in science classrooms. But some of the problems of practice that folks are facing are how do we really foster productive talk? So Michaels and O'Connor and Resnick and some other folks have done some great research around things like the Accountable Talk Sourcebook, and that is referenced in some of these tools that I'm going to talk about right now, and also some resources from Turk that are called Talk Science. So what do we do in the science classroom was the sort of question that we asked for this set of tools around creating productive disciplinary-based talk. So not generic, but very disciplinary-based talk. So this resource that we're looking at here, STEM Teaching Tool 35, is really addressing how we organize for talk. And in particular, this one was related how we organize for talk in terms of modeling practices. So how do we actually get out on the table some of those eliciting practices? How do we get students talking with each other about competing claims that they have about a model? How do we get them using evidence and reasoning with each other? And how do we minimize the amount that the teacher is talking in classroom and increase the amount that students are talking and reasoning and using new language and engaging in all of the great practices that we see inside the NGSS, but that we need to actually figure out how to do in our classrooms. So this brief is one of the ones that starts that. STEM Teaching Tool 48, which we'll come back to in a bit, also helps resource some of those things with things like talk tents and little talk resource cards. This STEM teaching tool is a sort of non-standard tool, which I wanted to kind of get at for a second. So a non-standard tool, this one has a flowchart, which looks at the purpose of the talk activity, and then it goes in, and from the flowchart you can follow down to any of the large purple boxes, and each of the large purple boxes, when you hit the flowchart, are hyperlinked. And they pull you out to a separate piece. So we're going to go to the idea coaching one right now, as if I was clicking on this in the website. and it actually gives you a full sheet. This is just a sort of sample of it, but it gives you a full page on trying out idea coaching and how you might want to do that. And STEM Teaching Tool 48, which we couple with this now, provides some talk tents that have these things like an idea coaching talk tent that has these kinds of questions on it. All right, so I want to pause for about 5 minutes here, and I want each of you to go to the STEM Teaching Tool website, flip through the collection, and find a few tools that you think may be of use to you. In the chat window, I want you to do 3 things. I want you to put a link to the tool you found, a quick note about why that's interesting, and describe how it might be useful to you. So take about 5 minutes. Do it for one tool first. If you still find you have time, find another tool and do that as well. All right, so go ahead and do that. Remember, as you go through putting tools in the chat window, that also put a note about why it's interesting to you and how you might use it. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I love your comments. Thank you very much. I'm going to just address a couple of comments generally. So math learning and the intersections with science and engineering. We are actually developing some resources internally and also with some other collaborators around the practice of using mathematics and computational thinking, which intersect at those spaces. So those will be coming online in the next year. There's also some existing resources when you look up engineering, which will bring in some aspects of mathematics, but they're going to be listed under engineering, so it's worthwhile to have a look at that. That is a really interesting space for us to think about more explicitly, because there have been some things in our implementation work that are keying in specifically on some mathematics and the overlaps with science. So definitely something to think about. And we will, if you know good ideas about that, definitely let us know. So what else in here? Oh, hello, Randy. Yeah, looking at the design work, there's a lot of design and modeling more generally. And we're expanding some of the engineering pieces. We have 3 engineering tools that are coming online, one on computational thinking practices and kind of unpacking some of those, one on systems thinking, and one on feedback loops, which should be totally up Randy's aisle. And I'm sure there are a huge number that we could also think about in some of the intersections with Globe and equity and some of the citizen science work, which I would love folks involved in that space to think about submitting some of that work into our pool. We would love to expand that space, especially thinking about earth science. I think that's a really rich space to think about how we can resource teachers in doing youth participatory action work or citizen science work in those spaces. That would be great. Yeah, and cross-cutting concepts, calling some of those out. I think the cross-cutting concepts ones are the ones we will actually pick up when we get into more of the earth system science. We are doing some collaborative work in climate science work right now that will also lead into this, but folks doing it across in other spaces, we would love to hear from you and think about how to build some of those resources with you or help you build those resources and, you know, gain that kind of professional capacity. That would be terrific. Okay, so let's take a look through some of the collective pieces. So I had mentioned earlier as we were going through that you can do the search window in the upper right. Things like formative assessment, those are great things to search on, and we have a couple collections that are put together on that. You can also search on things like assessment, background, climate science, engineering. Equity will actually probably overwhelm you because the equity is listed on a lot of things, but implementation, informal ed, like I had mentioned earlier in somebody's comment, and instruction and practices. If you're doing practices, I would type in science and engineering practices, or SEP. And Aida, I think when we're starting to process more things with the cross-cutting concepts, that also will be. We do have a cross-cutting concepts one, which I want to say is like 41, I think it is, that is really fabulous in terms of helping to write assessment items with cross-cutting concepts. So that's, and the science and engineering one around that is, I think, STEM Teaching Tool 30. If somebody can look those up and throw them in the chat window, that would be terrific. That those are also really, really helpful for writing assessment items and unpacking what science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts might look like in the classroom. We've actually been using them locally to even think about like informal formative assessment in the classroom, so as prompts and back pocket questions that you can have as you walk around the room. They're very, very helpful. For implementation guidance, we have a few things that are kind of more about how to use these. So this is really helpful to look at this particular set, to think about how you can use STEM teaching tools in different settings and how you can support teachers. These are really good resources to point your administrators at. Generally speaking, there are a wide range of uses that we can have for the STEM teaching tool space. Teachers reflecting on their own practices is like one of the easy, low-hanging fruit options. But really, to do this work, we should be working in collaborative spaces, so thinking about PD events, professional learning communities, working with our administrators in conversations even inside our own evaluation spaces. And then, of course, pre-service spaces, induction spaces. And one of the things that people have been using these for, which I think is really fabulous and we hadn't really thought through, was communicating with families and communities. So like taking the STEM teaching tool and using it and attaching it to your letter that you sent home about like what does science instruction look like these days. So that's a really interesting way to do it too. Okay, so let's move over to the PD modules. We're not going to really dig deep in here, but I just want to make you aware of some of the resources that are over here. So the PD modules covers 3 different areas. One is our open education resources, which have been heavily accessed and are great spaces for teacher educators. Then there's also our playlists, which are really more for teachers working in PLCs or for teachers working individually. And then some general PD resources, which we just had to find a space for because when we use them in our own professional development spaces, teachers love them so much they want to know where to get them. So we decided we would try and find a space to post them. So in terms of our open educational resources, these resources are coming out of work we are doing with the Council of State Science Supervisors. And it's a project called Access, which means Advancing Coherent and Equitable Systems of Science Equity. So we are currently working with 13 states across the country, but we're also sort of iterating occasionally, like once a year or twice a year, with all 50 states through the Council of State Science Supervisors. So these are the folks in your state science offices, and helping to get some feedback and co-design and develop resources that are helpful in teacher professional development settings as we shift toward the framework for K-12 science education. Our work in that space is really leveraging formative assessment. So these resources are very heavy on understanding assessment systems, on understanding both formal and informal formative assessment. And we frame this both in terms of cognitive assessment, so like that content space, but also in cultural assessment. So how are we bringing in the resource and assets from students' everyday experiences into the classroom space or into our informal learning spaces for, like somebody was mentioning about 4-H, and how are we using that knowledge and those experiences and identities that students are bringing into those spaces and interests, and then developing science activity in our classroom spaces that integrate that. So we have resources around that for formative assessment and for design work. Classroom sort of curriculum and lesson design. So one of the things that we focus on is assessment of student thinking, and the reason that we think that that's important is because often teachers have this sort of deficit perspective of how students understand some kind of conceptual area of science, and by really starting to open up the space of like, what are students thinking, we start to help see a shift in how teachers are framing students as resources in the classroom, that they have all these great ideas and now I just have to make sense of them. So in that vein, we have 3 sets of resources, and these are like 3+ hours of work, each of these resources, that they step through a whole range of things. They're set up in open access work, and you can get to them from the module space on the STEM Teaching Tool site. Resource A, which is around sort of basic introduction to understanding 3D formative assessment from an equitable perspective. Resource B, which is around really unpacking some of the STEM teaching tools on task format, so writing assessments and understanding how an assessment can be three-dimensional, just for jargon purposes, I'll unpack that one, meaning the 3 dimensions of the framework. So science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. And always in our work, we actually layer in interests and identity. So that's the equity perspective we bring to all of these tools. So while we might not say it up front, it's always there in everything we're doing. And then resource C is unpacking this idea of cultural formative assessment. What could it look like? What are some examples of it? How can you do it in your classroom? And so it gets down to actual classroom level examples. We also have Resource D, which will be coming online shortly. It is about daily formative assessment, so it helps you with a tool to actually write three-dimensional daily activities. So that could be an exit ticket, it could be informal questions that you're asking as you're walking around the classroom, those types of things. These are the sort of slate of things we have on schedule for what we're doing. So some facet analysis. Facet analysis comes from Jim Minstrel's work, and it's basically looking at the sense-making we do as teachers once we get an assessment back. How do we make sense of it beyond just right or wrong? How do we see the different ideas, the different linguistic resources that students are bringing, all of those components, and unpack them? So that one will be coming up shortly. We have full sets of work on that right now. We're just kind of going through a review process and a revision process right now with the Access group. And then F is also fully developed. We're just actually, we have the feedback actually back already. We're just synthesizing it. So, and that's about phenomena, because it turns out everybody is so excited about the phenomena-based instruction aspects of NGSS, and it's actually quite difficult to find those phenomena and make them really relevant. So we draw on some of the STEM teaching tools to think about how we can really find phenomena that are equitable and culturally situated for the students we're facing. And then there's a few others we're also working on, including that observation protocol, which is really important to work with your school principals and administrators. So in terms of the playlists are, right now we just have 3, I think, up. We're adding to them as you go, so if you have suggestions for playlists, please let us know. Right now we have some kind of introductions to what is the framework, both for teachers and for school principals. So we really encourage you to send the principals that playlist. And then we have one for engaging in teachers in diversity in science education, so unpacking what that means. So if you have we're just going to look at one of them right now. They are paneled together series of STEM teaching tools, and often others kind of conversations and questions and different kinds of things in between, to help you really think about how to organize learning, either for yourself or a small group of folks. So you can see the one for the equity and diversity playlist that we have. And that's really, really helpful just to kind of step through what is this framework stuff talking about. We have one on steps to designing a three-dimensional assessment, a short course that's also up there. And it goes through a number of different activities that you can work through. And draws in all sorts of different resources from the STEM teaching tool set, but kind of cohesively wraps them together. And this was the one I was talking about earlier around cross-cutting concepts, the STEM teaching tool 41. Teachers are finding this, we originally had been using this more for assessment, but in all ways inside instruction, teachers are finding this resource very helpful for thinking about what kinds of questions or activities can I do to kind of deepen my cross-cutting concept piece. And you can throw these into a curriculum that you already have just to deepen and make curriculum more three-dimensional. All right, so the facet work we are expanding right now because we're finding that that is a very high leverage move for helping teachers really see that it's not just about right and wrong, it's about developing ideas. And we will have a full resource in the PD module section on that shortly. These are just some pictures of the way we've used them with teachers to try and get teachers to think about not only what are the ideas, but how am I going to adjust instruction relative to that. And finally, the last little area that we wanted to talk about was this special little general area that we had. This bookmark that we created in collaboration with different people in the Washington State area turns out to be a really awesome little reference tool just for language, because we have a huge language load as teachers move into working in the framework. And it turns out we need a key to all the acronyms that we're loading ourselves with in this time. So both the language around science and engineering practice, like what are the 8 practices, and the disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts, and then some definitions around these like very specific language inside NGSS. So this has been a really helpful tool to hand out to teachers, and they always seem to have them on them. All right, we're also currently translating some of our tools into Spanish with the help of some collaborators, as well as some other resources that are moving into Spanish, which is very helpful to know if you work with large Latina populations. And if you want to write a brief for us, we have a URL there to our Research and Practice Partnership site, which will help you think about how to do that. And we highly encourage people in all different spaces to think about writing a practice brief or naming a problem to us that you want us to investigate or collaborate with on helping to develop another practice brief. There's some steps here on how to do it, and I won't talk through this right now, but I will definitely, if you want to set up a quick conversation with myself or with Phil Bell, who is the PI on all of this, the principal investigator on this work, he is happy to talk through this work with you as well. We have, again, I wanted to come back to that social media space. As the tools come out, we have a Twitter space where we have a publisher in-house here who is constantly posting new tools that are aware of. So it would be great to be able to connect yourself into this community, because there's a lot of really great resources that are circulated in this space. And our newsletter, it also comes out. We do it about once a month. You can sign up for it on our homepage. Please go ahead and do that as well, because then you just get notifications. And it's one of those things that you don't necessarily think to check back to the website, but it's terrific if you can go ahead and just get notifications that come onto your email occasionally. There's a bunch of different links here that I kind of tried to put all on one page. The Resource Collaboratory website has some of those how to write a practice brief spaces. We also have a Facebook page. And I also put Dr. Phil Bell's Twitter feed on here, because he also tweets a lot about different resources that he finds in other spaces and connections he's making. So it's really helpful to have him. And one I didn't post here, which I will look for, is Dr. Bill Penwell is also very well known in this space. And so it's a really big benefit to connect, if you are on Twitter, to connect with those two folks. All right, so any questions? I'm going to actually leave our slide on that connection space as I look for Bill Penwell. So any questions that folks have?
Please go ahead and put your questions up in the chat box. I noticed that there were some comments about designing engineering curricula around the framework and how these might be useful as people are thinking about that. And I was also thinking about how oftentimes teachers are tasked with doing things like, design an engineering curriculum. Okay. And they're put into yeah, right. We'll have that to you tomorrow, They're put into a small group, so a PLC forms, and maybe it's teachers who haven't worked together in the past, but how the briefs might help them to really become comfortable with collaborating. So being able to identify places where they have questions or places where they can get extra support, places where they might be able to come and observe each other in the practice. Deb, what would you say related to those things?
Well, there is actually another couple engineering. I know there's another one, apart from the ones I mentioned. There's also another one with some collaborative work we're doing across the country. We're connected with Brian Reiser's group, who's also doing a lot of the next-gen storyline work with Achieve. And so the engineering ones, I think I just did a quick search on engineering, and there's 71 different tools that reference engineering in some way, because engineering is a huge problem in practice for science-trained teachers who weren't trained in the engineering design process. So there are tools that get at the assessment around it, that get at working with English language learners, with the idea of managing frustration, which is something internally as a teacher we have to work out, and also with students. So in terms of designing curriculum, most of our resources are focused more at pedagogical aspects. in terms of how to engage in the classroom and do like more unit-based work. But larger curricular work, there are some pieces that we have that will help. So things like how to focus students' engineering design projects on science learning. So not pulling so far away from science that we're not also doing science inside our engineering work. So thinking about how to engage with that type of work. So I encourage you to do searches. I think it's Practice Brief 45 has a really great idea about focusing engineering projects, and that probably would be one of the more helpful ones in designing sort of school-level curricular aspects that are around engineering. But so anything that's in the sort of like 30s and above is going to be focused on some of the like more recent work that's coming out around engineering design work. And those would be helpful in working on curriculum pieces. But the next 4 engineering-related STEM teaching tools that are already in our pipeline, they will be very, very helpful with that as well. And I think just as a note to the general question of curricular design work as we go into implementation of NGSS, that is a increasing sort of thing that I have been hearing with teachers in practice. And I know that in California with the 3-course model, which actually has a lot of implications for all of you as geoscience teachers, is the 3-course model of California, which is being offered as a possible high school course pathway model, integrates earth science into all of the like traditional biology, chem, physics kind of pathways. And there is going to be an enormous need for professional development in earth system science for teachers who have no experience in that space and have had very little to no professional development in that space. So that's something we're also starting to try and resource and think about. And Ceres is, I saw Susan's name on the slide at the beginning, is going to be a huge resource in that space. So like the CleanNet.org space will be very beneficial for helping people try to figure out not to build a new house, but try to use the resources that people have already created as they move into some of that work.
That's great. So I was noticing that Carla McAuliffe had put a note in there about working with elementary teachers and including this in a newsletter that they have for them. I was wondering, too, as we were looking at the usage stats slide, do you have a feel for grade level breakdown or perhaps from some of the professional development or your research and practice experiences, what the uptake is of the materials among middle school and elementary school educators?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the statistics on that, but from the experiences that I've had in the professional development space and from work across the country with myself and other collaborators, these resources are actually being used really broadly K-12, and actually some of them are moving into university level as university professors are starting to think about reformation in their courses. So particularly the aspect of culturally responsive pedagogy, because, science is so under-resourced in that space. Because we're having a lot of trouble in places like chemistry, for instance, and making sure that we have equitable participation of historically marginalized populations, use of color, women in those spaces. And so, how to really shift your pedagogical and curricular practices so that you're actually inviting those populations into the learning is really what those tools are helping with. In the elementary sort of middle school space, there's a fair amount of uptake of these resources and use of these resources because they are short and they synthesize huge pools of research down into a really pragmatic kind of resource that you can use. So that's a real advantage because we're not asking people to read a whole book on engineering design. We're asking you to engage with 4 tools in a 2-hour kind of activity session about how we do this. And you can use them, intersperse them with learning activities around doing engineering or doing some other aspect of learning that really helps. So it helps frame the why. And I think too often that's a challenge that we're facing in teacher education is we don't offer teachers the really clear why are we doing this and the theory behind it. And that's a gap that these tools are really filling. Connecting that kind of theoretical reasoning to practice.
That's great. Thanks for that. So I see we have one additional person who's typing into the chat right now, I think. So we'll see if something pops up there. Maybe not. Okay. Oh, there it is. Are there tools in the collection that touch upon the use of simulations and modeling?
Yeah, so we are working on some of the computational thinking ones that will touch on what you're thinking about, I think, Randy, knowing your work, what you're thinking about modeling. I ought to say I would love UCAR to be able to produce some resources too or co-develop some resources with us because you have such amazing data sets. So thinking about actually building out some specific sort of where are resources type of STEM teaching tools would be very helpful. And I think inside Earth System Science, I could envision a resource that would be, UCAR and NOAA and NASA and like a collection of those things and like why are these resources sort of, useful in thinking about curricular work or in thinking about classroom-based data sets that you might use and how might you use them. So that would be something that would be really interesting to talk to you about. There are, the term modeling is a little tricky, and I know that many of you are aware of that. So there's a lot of different ways in which we talk about modeling, the use of modeling practices inside the classroom for learning, the use of scientific modeling practices, and so we have some STEM teaching tools that actually unpack that and try to make that clearer inside of what we mean by modeling. But there are also some pieces that we're working on to try and increase clarity on that. So we do have a few resources in the pool around that.
That's great. And I want to thank you, Deb, for giving us a tour of a very, very deep and dense piece of resource out there for all of us to use in a variety of different ways. So thanks for that.
Absolutely.
John, if you can put up our closing slides real quickly. Deb, you had just mentioned resources from places like NASA and NOAA, and hey, that was a great lead into what our next webinar is going to be all about. So
I know, I'm excited about that.
Yeah, really. Reminder to go ahead and register for that one. We'll be sending out the link very soon. Thursday, November 9th, 1 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, a sampling of federal education resources supporting Earth and space science instruction. NOAA will be there, and NASA Goddard will be there, as will American Geosciences Institute. So we'll hear from them. Please visit our session at GSA. And Deb, we want to thank you one more time. We appreciate your time and sharing all of this great work with us. And thank you to all of our participants for your questions and your contributions through the chat window.
Thanks
very much for joining us. Have a great afternoon, everybody.